ask Professor Machinist to lead us through the Jewish perspective on biblical studies.
Thank you. I hope you won't mind if I sit down. In the biblical tradition, sometimes sitting down is for judges. Sometimes it's for the accused. I hope tonight it's at least for the saved. I'm very honored to be among you this evening, and indeed in Rome this fall at the Biblicum, and it's been a very special treat for my wife and me and for our son who's joined us for the last 2 weeks. And it's a particular honor tonight to be able to talk, at least in modest compass, about classical Jewish perspectives and interpretations of the Bible. The first problem is, what should we call the text that we comment on? Is it the Old Testament? Is it the First Testament, as Professor Kolarczyk has just mentioned? Is it, in Hebrew terms, the Tanakh, an acronym that refers to the classic threefold division of the Old Testament in Jewish terms? Is it the Torah? Or is it the term that has come increasingly into popular and scholarly usage over the last several decades, the Hebrew Bible? You can take your pick. Each of these is not simply a semantic game, but obviously carries with it a certain theological significance. But without going into all of that in detail tonight, I will settle at least in a somewhat arbitrary way on the term Hebrew Bible. But not simply labels are at stake here. The organization of the Hebrew Bible, in whatever tradition we choose to read it, is also a matter of significance. As in the New Testament, so the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament is not only a book, but books, ta biblia, as the Greek has it. And the books are arranged, as I'm sure most of you are aware, differently both within Jewish tradition itself and between Jewish and Christian traditions, and these differences of arrangement can have theological meaning. Perhaps the most dramatic example is with the prophetic book of Malachi. In the standard Jewish tradition, it is the last of the prophets, or the prophetic section, but it is not the last book of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. In most Christian traditions, at least those with which I'm familiar, it is the last book of the Old Testament altogether, leading into the New. And in the last chapter of Malachi, as you know, there is a promise about the return of the prophet Elijah, in whose coming matters of judgment will be resolved. A very nice transition then for the early Christian community into the New Testament, where the question of Elijah and the one coming after Elijah is, of course, of major moment, particularly between John the Baptist and Jesus himself. The Hebrew Bible is also not simply a text, but in Jewish tradition, a way of life. Indeed, it is life itself. And perhaps this is best encapsulated in the verses that conclude the reading of the Bible, the reading of the Torah on a weekly basis on the Sabbath in Jewish liturgy, where we are told that the Torah is an Eitz Chaim, a tree of life to those who grasp on it, and to those who are dependent or hold on to it, it is a source of straight living. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, if you will. Its paths are paths of peace. Here then the Torah, meaning the entire Hebrew Bible, is itself a way of living. This notion of the text as not simply a document, but a mirror and a guide to living begins early, and perhaps the earliest stage that we can recognize is the discovery of the so-called scroll, the Sefer, which may, as many would argue, be at least an early form of the book of Deuteronomy, in the reign of the king of Judah known as Josiah toward the end of the 7th century BC. By the Second Temple period, that is the period from roughly the 5th or 4th centuries BC to the end of the 1st century AD, the Hebrew Bible becomes, at least as an ideal, and it seems often in practice, a way of life. And scholars recently have begun to talk about a kind of scripturalization of life, that the real life that a pious Jew lives is the life of not only studying but enacting the Torah. The Torah is really life, and we as its enactors are simply a simulacrum, a mirror of that life. One way to express this concept is through an image that again begins to emerge in early rabbinic literature, perhaps the 2nd or 3rd century AD, as the scholar Gabriele Boccaccini has commented on in the last 25 years. The notion here is that the Torah, meaning not just simply our Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, but everything contained with it, was not something simply given to Moses in the traditional view of things on Mount Sinai, but it had existed before God even began to create the universe itself. Here, the rabbis, depending on a verse in the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, verses 22 and following, where the concept of wisdom, Hebrew chokhmah, is spoken about as a kind of apostrophized person, a goddess even, who says in chapter 8 of Proverbs that she's there when God began to create the universe and was God's oman, which I take as a Hebrew version of a Mesopotamian word, umanu, that means craftsman or scholarly advisor of the sort that we need these days, more advisors than we perhaps have, but that's another story. In any case, Chokhmah, or wisdom, in that chapter of Proverbs, Proverbs 8, says she was there when God began to create the universe and helped God to do so. The rabbis understood Chokhmah, or wisdom, as Torah, and then went on to argue that Torah was created thousands of years before the creation of the universe. As this doctrine was elaborated, the understanding was that that original Torah was the Torah in its entirety, but that bits of it were gradually revealed to Israel and then humanity over time, of which the revelation to Moses on Sinai was key. But that this revelation to Moses didn't stop giving out Torah. It continues on to the present and into the indefinite future. Commentaries on Torah are part of Torah, and the Hebrew word Torah, which literally means teaching, becomes extended in meaning to grasp not only the text that we call the Old Testament, but the entire tradition before and after that will never stop. If this Torah then is successively revealed, this means that at any given time of human existence, we do not have all of its meanings. That the Torah or Bible can and does have many meanings and levels of meaning. And one way to express this in classical Jewish interpretation is to talk about the 70 Phases of Toga, which on your handout is number 3. Here I just briefly, from an article by Rabbi Alan Mahler, will pick up one of the texts that he there indicates. Quoting Psalm 62, "One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard," the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the great repository of classical Jewish law, goes on to say, one biblical verse may convey several teachings. And in Rabbi Ishmael's school, one of the great rabbinic sages, it was taught, here quoting Jeremiah 23, like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces, that is, says that Ishmael, just as the rock is split into many splinters, so also may one biblical verse convey many teachings. In short, classical Jewish interpretation, as in the traditions we will hear about shortly, is not fundamentalist learning. There are a number of ways, 70 or more, 70 is a magic number in this tradition, by which the Torah can be approached. And what I'm going to talk with you about then this evening, I want to focus on the interpretation of this Hebrew Bible, this Torah, briefly within the Hebrew Bible itself and the Second Temple period. In other words, somewhere down to about the 1st century A.D., and then more extensively in the classical rabbinic tradition from roughly the 1st century A.D. through the 16th centuries. I'm not going to try to compress this into 2 minutes, but just a few highlights. But I wanted to give you a sense of just how much chronological travel we would otherwise have to make. In the Second Temple and classical rabbinic periods, we find that the Hebrew Bible becomes a canonical text, that is to say, a closed authoritative document for the community. And the framework of its interpretation is developed at this point as well, as manifest in a variety of texts. As many observers have noted, Jewish writing in the classical rabbinic period, 1st century to the 16th, is in one form or another very largely, though not entirely, concerned with or in reference to the Hebrew Bible. And this is all graphically illustrated by the first item on your handout, the photograph under number 1, which is a page from what has become known as the Great Rabbinic Bible, first issued in Venice in the year 1516 to 1517, curated by Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim, but published by a Christian publisher, Daniel Bomberg. It came out in a second edition about 10 years later in 1524. If you look at this page, the large scale on the right side, you don't have to read Hebrew to know this, or Aramaic, but the large scale is the text of the Hebrew Bible. All around it are various ancient versions. Immediately to its left, the Aramaic interpretive translation, in this case of Onkelos, and another Aramaic text on the top of the left-hand side. And then the smaller print are various classical rabbinic commentators. So you don't read this text of the Bible alone, you read it within the context of subsequent Jewish tradition, all of which is designed to bring out the eternal Torah. On Christian levels, in roughly the same period as this text, 16th and 17th centuries, we have the great so-called polyglots produced in Europe, where a page of the Old or New Testament would be set out in Greek or in Hebrew with a variety of ancient versions. So here, again, in all the traditions, the sense was the text of the Hebrew Bible, while supreme and central, is not alone. What then does classical rabbinic interpretation of the Bible involve? Before we get there, we have to say that what is involved was already in some sense underway within the Hebrew Bible itself. Here the buzzword intertextuality is important, namely the way one text refers to or takes over another. One prime example in the Hebrew Bible is the text about the care and freeing of Hebrew slaves in Exodus chapter 21, which in Deuteronomy 15 is amended so that women and male slaves who are treated differently in Exodus 21 are treated in the same way in Deuteronomy 15. Indeed, the American scholar Michael Fishbane, in a famous work of the mid-1980s, Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel, has argued that some of the techniques of biblical interpretation that became specified and formalized in classical rabbinic interpretation after the Bible can already be found in the Bible itself, though not explicitly labeled as such. In the period immediately following the Bible, the so-called Second Temple period, from roughly the 5th or 4th centuries BC to the 1st century AD, we have a number of Jewish texts which involve either translation from the original Hebrew and Aramaic of the Bible into another language like Greek, or interpretation, or citation. The Greek versions, known as the Septuagint, are one example. The Aramaic versions I just mentioned under the term Targum are another example. Philo of Alexandria, writing in Greek, is a Greek Jew living in Egypt who lays out in a number of texts that have survived his interpretations of the Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide other options. Various apocrypha and pseudepigrapha are both interpretations of and references to the Hebrew Bible. And finally, I would say the most striking Jewish reference is the New Testament. The first systematic efforts on the part of the rabbis to put together a group of guidelines as to how to interpret the text, hermeneutical rules, if you will, are found at the end of the Second Temple period and on into the 2nd century AD. These are collections of what are called midot, M-I-D-D-O-T, to transliterate the Hebrew. It means measures. And we have several collections which show that the rabbis were thinking, at this point anyway, systematically, explicitly, and abstractly about rules governing how to interpret a sacred text. There are also key terms that develop in the classical rabbinic period, coming at the end and slightly overlapping the Second Temple period and going on through the 16th century AD. And these terms are contained for you in the final page of the handout. I just will read them very quickly. Halacha, Agadah, Peshat, Darash, Midrash, and then a strange word which is an acronym. In other words, its letters stand for different terms that are incorporated within it. The term Pardes, meaning paradise. You can get a brief explanation on the page of the handout. I want to emphasize here that of these terms, the most important for the interpretive methods of the rabbis are Peshat and Darash. Peshat meaning a kind of contextual meaning, understanding the verse within its immediate context. Darash meaning an understanding of the verse within a wider context, such that some of the understanding in Darash would not be obvious to somebody who's looking simply at Peshat. These two terms, Peshat and Darash, govern many, if not most, of the classical rabbinic texts interpreting the Hebrew Bible, but not all. The term Pardes, this acronym, takes up Peshat and Darash, but it adds two other terms. Remez, as you can see from the last page of the handout, meaning roughly allegory, found rather rarely. Perhaps the main Jewish example would be commentary on the Song of Songs. And the final term, sod, which means a secret or a mystery. And this is a term of interpretation that's primarily oriented toward works of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, and particularly the major work of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar. If you look at number 12 on your handout, which is on page 3, under the top of the page, Here I give you an example from the Zohar, the Kabbalistic work, which deals with the opening phrase of the book of Genesis, "In the beginning God created." I won't read it all, but if you read it and you can find that that's what the opening verse is saying, you're better than I am. To operate at the level of sod, of mystery or secret, the rabbis tell us, you have to be a specially inducted person. You have to be a member of a special elite, only male, naturally. Usually about the age of 40, somebody who is well versed in the whole tradition, legal and otherwise, of Judaism. Somebody, in other words, who will not go crazy in terms of finding meanings in the text that are so deep or so high or both that no ordinary person could have any idea that they were there. But once they are exposed, it's obvious that they are the meanings that count the most. This is what the Kabbalists say. So we'll leave aside that for a moment and go back to this issue where sod is presented as part of a rubric called Pardes. It seems to be a rubric, as I mentioned on the 5th page of the handout, that was invented as such in the Middle Ages by one Moshe de Leon, Moses de Leon, late 13th century AD, to gather together what he understood to be the 4 major interpretive methods that I've just mentioned to you, and to include sod among these. By so doing, he provides a justification for the importance not only of the method of mystical interpretation, but more particularly for the Zohar, which non-coincidentally he composed, or at least helped to compose, depending on where you stand in the current scholarship on the matter. This 4-fold grouping, however, had wider circulation, and it may be connected somehow to the 4-fold method in Christian biblical interpretation, though this is disputed. As for Peshat and Darash, the Tun-Bey methods, at times it's hard to really make a distinction between them. You can find an interpreter who uses both in the very same text of interpretation, although sometimes you can find a sharp distinction between them. And one of those cases is on the page of the handout under number 4, the first page, where a medieval Jewish commentator from France, who goes by the nickname Rashbam, it's also an acronym, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Meir, who is the grandson of an even more famous commentator on the Bible, Rashi, Rabbi Solomon, the son of Isaac. Here the grandson talks about his father as being outmoded, but in a very nice way. He says, "I, Samuel," in the first quotation under number 4, son of Rabbi Meir, his son-in-law of blessed memory. There are all kinds of honorifics that you put in. "I debated with my grandfather in his presence, and he admitted to me that if he had had the opportunity, he would compose different commentaries according to the new Peshat interpretations coming to light every day." The next paragraph toward the end amplifies this point. Earlier commentators, say the grandson Rashbam, out of their piety busied themselves by tending toward the homiletical. That's the way this translator translates the word darash. They tended toward darash interpretations as they are the essential ones, so they said, and for this reason they did not become trained in the actual peshat of Scripture. What Rashbam seems to be saying here is that too many of these darash interpreters, including his grandfather, got carried away and began to see in biblical verses all kinds of meanings that were not there if you examine these verses in their immediate contextual environment. And that's where we must start, says Rashbam. Yeah. So let me look finally at a couple of examples in the handout that will illustrate something of what I have been saying. And I ask you to turn to page 2, under number 8. A number of these texts that I've given you here all deal with the opening verses of Genesis chapter 1. Here, in a text by a Rabbi Samuel, the verse of the Bible is cited, "In the beginning God created," and then the interpretation. "This reads literally," said Rabbi Samuel, "in the beginning created God." The act of creation is mentioned first. That's literally translated, "in the beginning created God." The act of creation is mentioned first, says the rabbi, because the created testifies to the existence of the Creator. Thus, from the created, man recognizes the Creator, even as Job declared, "Out of my own flesh will I discern God." So you quote a proof text from somewhere else in the Bible, and the point of this is the very fact that I exist, a thing created, is proof of the existence of God, the Creator, and that's why the word God, the subject of created, comes last. Now that may not be an entirely correct point of Hebrew grammar, but it certainly works theologically. So we would call this a darash interpretation, but trying to use a little peshat, at least under the table. Let me mention one last one, and this will take us to page 3, to Rashi himself, under number 13. This too is a darash interpretation, but it bears on a peshat understanding of context. "In the beginning, Rabbi Isaac," this is Rashi, really, he said, "The Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse," quoting Exodus 12, verse 2, "This month shall be unto you the first of the months," because that is the first commandment given to Israel. In other words, if the Torah is basically a law book, why spend a whole book without law? This is nuts. What's going on here? The answer. What is the reason then that it commences with the account of the creation? Because of the thought expressed in the text of Psalms 111, quote, "He declared to his people the strength of his works, in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations. For should the peoples of the world say to Israel, 'You are robbers, because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan,' the nations who in biblical terms preceded Israel in the land of Israel, if you say that, Israel may reply to these peoples, 'All the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created and gave it to whom He pleased.'" In other words, we are not doing a task of robbery, we are following divine commandment. You may find that an insufficient argument, but it's a very interesting comment on the situation when Rashi wrote this in the 11th century AD. Let me make one last comment. What is the relationship of these nodes and assumptions of biblical interpretation to modern critical biblical scholarship as practiced particularly in the Western tradition? There have been 2 arguments here. Some say that the modern West is entirely different. Frederick Greenspan, a colleague of mine, among others, has argued there's much precedent for what we do now already in pre-modern classical Jewish terms, and indeed in classical Christian terms. And indeed, that's true. There is some effort already in the classical rabbis, and other examples I've given you will show this, that the rabbis were concerned with the analysis of the language, the Hebrew and the Aramaic of the Hebrew Bible, as we now are. But I would suggest there are 2 final things which separate them from us, at least those of us who are modern critical scholars. We do not have the limits placed on how far historical criticism can proceed. We're willing to keep everything open on the basic assumption that we must start with the Bible as, first of all, a human document, which leads to the second point. It may be a document ultimately from the divine, but as modern critical Western scholars, we cannot argue rationally for that conclusion. We have to argue rationally for what we have, which is a human document put together and transmitted by humans and subject, therefore, to human foibles and successes. So I leave you with that question. We are in a different mode, but a mode that nonetheless must pay attention to our pre-modern predecessors. If we do not always agree with their answers, we find that they often ask the best questions about the meaning of the text. Thank you.
It's actually for Professor Machinist, who was just there. You did allude in one fragment of one sentence to the New Testament and its relevance to understanding the Jewish context. Could you expand on that a little bit?
I could stand on one foot as Rabbi Hillel did, but I'm not sure I could expound the whole Torah. But I start from the fact that the bulk of the New Testament composed in the first century is not completely, certainly, but certainly in a major way the work of Jewish Christians, and as is well known, embodies certain of the scriptural techniques that all of us were talking about, and is built really on one could look at the New Testament, certainly the Gospels, as an effort to understand the Old and the New, or to compose a set of midrashim on the Old. So in that sense, I was talking about it as a Christian, as a Jewish document.